Welcome, friends. You're listening to Conversations with Consequences. This is the weekly radio show and podcast of the Catholic Association, where you get witty and charming conversation about the topics that matter to you with the leading thinkers of our time. If you're listening on the radio, you're listening at 11 a.m. on Fridays on the Guadalupe Radio Network. And if not, you're listening for free wherever you get your podcasts. You can subscribe to our show at thecatholicassociation.org/podcasts. I'm your hostess, Dr. Grazie Christie, and today I'm joined by my colleague at the Catholic Association, Ashley McGuire. She's in D.C. and I'm in Miami. Hi, Ashley.
Hey, Gracie.
We are connected by the marvels of all sorts of IT that don't always work out, but they're working out today, right?
Yes, thankfully.
Today we're going to have a really interesting show. We have a great guest who, Ashley knows him personally. I haven't met him, but I'm looking forward to meeting him. In fact, he's coming down soon to our private school, our little parochial school here in Key Biscayne, where I live. We've asked him to come down and give us a talk on why marriage matters to children. And by this, you might understand that he's an expert on marriage, all sorts of things about marriage. His name is Dr. Bradford Wilcox, and he is the director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. He's also a senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, and he's published many studies on marriage, parenthood, cohabitation, and also a lot of studies on the way that marriage, gender, and culture influence the quality and stability of family life in the United States. He's been published all over the place, and he consults with large companies on fertility and marriage trends. Companies like Nestle and Procter & Gamble, they want to know who's having babies, when, and how many, so they can be prepared. And you know him, Ashley, from a while back, from your start as a journalist, as a cultural warrior.
Right, yeah. So I've been writing for the Institute for Family Studies for a while, writing sort of from the perspective of a young woman who is having children and started having children a lot younger than sort of my demographic, with a shared interest in promoting marriage as something that benefits women, men, children, and society.
And to talk about marriage, we don't have to this is the Catholic Association. This is a Catholic radio show, but there's no reason to talk about marriage from a religious perspective when we need to talk about the value of marriage. Isn't that true?
Yeah, and I think, in our discussion with Brad, we'll really get into the fact that I think people on both sides of the political spectrum and all different faith backgrounds are really starting to understand that, just how impactful marriage and stable families are for everybody.
Yeah, I think maybe when the marriage thing started to fall apart a few decades ago in the United States or in the West, religious conservatives were the ones who were sort of standing up and saying, "No, stop! This is not a good idea." But I think there's a lot of people joining religious conservatives because they're watching the side effects, the evil side effects of the abandonment of marriage. So with that, why don't we call in Dr. Wilcox, who is an expert on all things marriage. Dr. Brad Wilcox, welcome to Conversations with Consequences.
It's great to be here with you guys today.
So we were telling our listeners, first of all, about your expertise in the fields of marriage, family, and all things, all the way those things influence the culture of the United States. But maybe you can tell us first, to start, what brought you to this position where you are concentrating so hard on these family structures and how marriage impacts culture?
Well, I was raised by a single mom, and I think really it was actually in college here at the University of Virginia that I began to think more deeply about my own experience growing up, about the importance of fathers, and about the way in which marriage tends to tie dads more closely to their children. So, that kind of life experience was a big motivation for me in thinking about how marriage and fatherhood today matter for our kids in the U.S., in 2019.
So going from how these things matter and in a personal experience, how did your life, your life at school, your academic life lead you to your position at the National Marriage Project?
Well, I did a postdoc both at Princeton and then also at Yale University, studying the role of religion in family life. And then as it got kind of established here at UVA, University of Virginia, I focused more and more directly on marriage and child well-being. And what happened was that David Papineau, who was the co-director of the National Marriage Project, it was then at Rutgers, was retiring, and I asked him if he wanted to pass the reins to me here at the University of Virginia, and he said yes. He said that'd be great. So that was sort of the step that led to the National Marriage Project migrating from Rutgers University down here to UVA.
Brad, this is Ashley. So in the many years that you've been studying marriage and family life, and you've really sort of explored it from so many different angles, and I think one of the reasons you've been a really effective voice in the culture, not just in a sort of a corner niche, but like in the mainstream culture, is the way that you've explored things from all different angles, and your research has really sort of uncovered things and sort of put to rest misperceptions. What do you think have been some of the most interesting findings you've uncovered in your research, and what has resonated the most? What has created the most sort of ripples?
Well, I think my focus on the class divide in American marriage and family life, I published a report called When Marriage Disappears, and that focused on the way in which marriage becomes more fragile, weaker among not just the poor, but among the working class. And that report got a lot of attention in NPR and many other venues. And so I think since then I've been thinking a lot about and trying to figure out ways to bridge this class divide in American family life. And I think one thing that I've done is to try to figure out how a lot of progressive concerns, things like concerns equality, for instance, or the poor state of the American dream for many poor children, how these kinds of progressive concerns connected to what's happening in our families. So it's research like that, findings like that I think help at least some people, some open-minded people, understand and recognize that a lot of progressive concerns intersect with the strength, the stability of marriage and family life here in America.
What do you think are some of the most standout data points on that front? I mean, I think, having been somebody who's written for the Institute for Family Studies blog for many years and, reads a lot of this with great interest, one of the statistics I've always found fascinating is, and I can never quite get it right, something to the effect of children born into a home, a broken home, have something like an 80% chance of growing up in poverty or living in poverty as adults, or what are some of the 3 or 4 most sort of striking statistics on that front that you've encountered?
Sure. I think one of the things that I've seen is that kids who grow up in an intact married family are about twice as likely to graduate from college, controlling for a bunch of other factors, that 97% of millennials today who have gotten some kind of education, at least a high school degree, worked full-time and married before having any children, are steering clear of poverty, and more than 80% of them are in the middle or upper class as millennials. So that just sort of shows how kind of following a classic, what's called success sequence, still provides a path towards realizing the American dream, is also, I think, a kind of a striking statistic. And then, as I said before, both I and Raj Chetty, who's now at Harvard Economics, have found that what's happening in our neighborhoods, family-wise, is one of the top predictors, not only actually of economic mobility for poor kids, but also of incarceration rates for boys. So, what we're seeing is that on a variety of levels, on the individual level, the household level, the neighborhood level, what's happening in terms of marriage matters a lot for kids, adults, and communities. And those are the kinds of statistics that illustrate, how all this stuff impacts our kids, adults, and communities.
Don't you find that progressives and liberals, they reject very much the idea that marriage is a sort of a panacea, no, for all these cultural ills, like the ones you just mentioned, any kind of social dysfunction, especially for children, that marriage is an amazing way to treat all these things, right? Like reinventing the culture of marriage or reinvigorating it, or making marriage again seem accessible, something that anyone can achieve, even people who are less than rich, or people who are poor. But liberals and progressives resist that because their narrative is that what keeps people down is racism and income inequality. Do you find that your research and the way that you point to these connections, do you find that you could get people on that side of the thinking divide to start to love marriage again as a solution?
Yeah, it's a profound, I think, challenge facing us as a country. We did a piece on family studies, familystudies.org, on October 10th. Wendy Wong and I did, and we looked at how liberals and conservatives look differently at marriage, and are also much more. There's also big disparities in terms of their odds of being married. So we find that only 33% of liberals would agree that marriage is needed to create strong families, and that compares to 80%
Wow.
of conservatives. So a huge divide.
That's a shocker. That's a shocker to me. The 33%.
Yeah, it's huge. And then in terms of looking who's married today, it's 62% of conservatives. This is adults, and only 39% of self-described liberals are married. So that's also a huge divide. So in terms of both practice and
That's amazing.
Belief or belief and behavior, we have seen, I think, a pretty major ideological divide grow up in the last, 4 decades or so. And that's problematic because marriage, I don't think should be an ideological issue. It shouldn't be a religious issue. Marriage is seen in many different contexts, obviously, from China to India to Egypt to the West. So it's not a Christian thing. And I don't think it's a conservative thing. It's a human, I think, thing, an institution that's really obviously served the welfare of kids and adults across many different cultural contexts and historical time periods. So, yeah, I think the challenge facing us is, can we make arguments, tell stories that will make folks in the middle of the ideological continuum, and folks who are sort of on the center left, liberals, but not necessarily progressives, more open to sort of appreciating and talking about the value of marriage. And one key point here is that college-educated Americans are much more likely today to get married and to stay married, even if they're obviously, more liberal-minded. I think the challenge is trying to sort of basically say to them, look, folks, what you're doing in your private life actually has some real value for the larger society, and can we talk about this in public? So practically, that means like encouraging doctors, encouraging school superintendents, encouraging executives in the C-suite who overwhelmingly enjoy strong and stable marriages to be more open, with their employees, with their students, with their patients, about how marriage and stable family life more generally is so helpful, both to them, but to the country and the communities more generally.
In my experience with liberals, and some of them are very close to me, people in my family, my married family especially, in my experience, they feel, and they've said this to me, that that to them it seems like when they speak about marriage to people who are poor or minorities, I'm a minority and my married family aren't minorities, that they don't feel comfortable saying that because they're asking them to do something that they're not capable of, as though marriage is this unattainable good or attainable only by certain classes. It's almost like a reverse bigotry. It's been my experience with liberals. And I try to explain to them, I say, well, we Hispanics or other people of other races are just as capable of achieving marital stability but maybe we live in cultures and are being educated by people who tell us that that's not necessary anymore, or that that's not where our happiness lies. What do you think of that? Is that kind of a reverse bigotry?
Yeah, I think there is this idea on the part of some that marriage is now kind of out of reach of the poor, especially. A New York Times, economics writer kind of made that argument, about 2 years ago. And what I think, of course, it fails to recognize and to acknowledge, on the one hand, is that today there are many poor Americans, particularly immigrants, to be frank, who are stably and happily married. And so they're obviously pointing a path out to the rest of us, that indicates that you don't have to be middle class or rich to be successfully married. And we also can point, too, to the fact that in the heights of the Great Depression in the 1930s, most married couples, managed to make it. Lots of strains, lots of stresses, lots of problems, but they managed to maintain their marriages, through a very difficult time economically. At the same time, though, I think we have to acknowledge that, our family lives depend tremendously on our social networks, on our friends and family members. And insofar as marriage has broken down, has gotten more fragile in many poor and many working class communities across the U.S., what that means practically is that people don't necessarily have models, in their lives of other couples, of friends and family members who have forged a strong and stable marriage. So if we want to kind of revive the fortunes of marriage, in many poor and working class communities across the U.S. and, including South Florida, for instance, or, East D.C. or, rural Virginia, what we need to do is to figure out ways that churches and other nonprofits can put out both a positive message about marriage and family life, but link that to some real opportunities for people to be mentored and sort of led into reviving marriage in their own social networks and communities.
Just dovetailing on this, and going back to your point about talking with schools, this was something I've thought about a lot, which is, this is different than talking about minorities, but I think it always shocks me that I went through however many years of education, including college, without anybody ever once talking to me about thinking about marriage and how that would integrate with my professional goals. And then, suddenly within a couple years of graduating from school, so many people are in a position where they're wanting to get married. And I think, another sort of needed project is, and this is something I've tried to do both in my own personal life and in my work, is to paint a positive portrayal of marriage for women, because I think so many young women, especially those with professional aspirations, are sort of led to believe that it's incompatible with their career. And that has sort of a trickle-down effect when, and I see this playing out in the real world in my own life where, women are delaying marriage, and then that leads to other complications related to fertility problems, and it sort of creates like a domino cascade of issues when, in fact, marriage, and I know you've written a lot, too, about, the timing of marriage and marrying young or marrying later and the effects that has with happiness and income, and that it's a very sort of complex issue. But I do think that, to your point about, just sort of talking and thinking about marriage is something that women should be doing a lot sooner than, 28 years old, and B, surrounding themselves with, and this is something, again, I feel fortunate about, surrounding yourself with role models of women who have happy marriages and have gone on to have children, in many cases, many children. So these are just some of the many challenges that are presented in terms of how we convince the culture that marriage is something that's good for men and women and children.
Yeah, I think in terms of, the issues you've just raised, one key takeaway is that a lot of folks think that 30 is the new 20.
Right.
and that 40 is the new 30. And what that means is you can spend your 20s
being a teenager.
Being a teenager as sort of your odyssey years, having fun, exploring yourself, and kind of just getting situated. And then when you're 29, you can kind of get serious about dating and mating and everything else. And the reality, though, is that people who get married in their mid-20s, kind of broadly defined, tend to forge the happiest marriages. They obviously have more kids, and they tend to marry someone who shares their faith. So if things like marital happiness, having, a bunch of children and sharing, your faith with your spouse are important, then kind of looking to marry in your mid-20s, rather than sort of postponing it until you're 30 or 35, I think makes a lot of sense. And yeah, you're right. We don't really have these conversations, frankly, with young adults today. I try to do that in my class at UVA, but I think most young adults are focusing on work and schooling in their 20s, not recognizing it's actually a great time to get serious about finding a spouse as well if they think marriage is in their future.
You made me very happy with that response, Dr. Wilcox. I have two older children. My two oldest children are getting married in their early 20s next year. So I'm excited that that's going to spell more success for them. So the music means that we have to take a little break, but we'll be right back to talk more with you, Dr. Wilcox, about marriage. Welcome back, friends. This is Conversations with Consequences, and I'm your hostess, Dr. Grazie Christie. Today, I'm joined remotely from D.C. I'm in Miami by Ashley McGuire, my colleague at the Catholic Association, and we have a great guest, Dr. Brad Wilcox, who is the director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. We've been talking marriage, how important marriage is for the culture, for children, it does all sorts of good things for us. And right before the break, Dr. Wilcox, we were talking about ways, how important it is to promote marriage. Even though maybe it seems, when I was going to mention to you that when I finally convince someone who's more on the liberal side that marriage could be a really great thing, they say, well, the genie's out of the bottle. Nobody's ever going to take marriage back up as the way it used to be. But you did a great study. You were involved in a great project called, and I have the article here, How Baptists and Catholics Together Help Save Thousands of Florida Marriages. And I found it really compelling, and I was hoping you could tell us about it.
Yeah, so my colleagues and I released a report about a week and a half ago in Washington that basically describes how an initiative sponsored by the Philanthropy Roundtable called the Culture of Freedom Initiative was launched in Jacksonville, Florida. And they launched this in 2016, and within about 3 years, they saw the divorce rate fall by about 20%. And this decline was larger than that seen in the state of Florida more generally, and the U.S. as well. So as we kind of look at this initiative, we think that the evidence suggests that they really did succeed in bringing divorce down more than it would have come down otherwise. Because as you may or may not know, divorce has been coming down for a while, actually, especially since the Great Recession. So what this initiative, though, did was they had churches doing more to preach and teach about marriage. They had an online digital campaign, so they would have people would see like ads and videos, online in terms of Facebook and YouTube and Instagram. They're all kind of sending them more positive messages about marriage and family life. And then they had a number of kind of public offerings too, like they had comedians come into Jacksonville and do date nights for couples and gave them kind of, humorous messages, but also messages that reinforced, in a funny and appropriate way, kind of the value of forging a stronger marriage, working through difficulties and the like. And so in the wake of these kinds of efforts, and they spent, I think, more than $5 million on this initiative over 3 years, we did see the divorce rate come down much more in Jacksonville than across the country as a whole.
Are there other examples of initiatives that have been successful like this, maybe not on such a large scale, that you've encountered?
Well, I've seen a similar kind of effort in Chattanooga, Tennessee, with a group called First Things First, where they're also they're producing videos, radio spots, ads on bus stops, and offering programmatic activities to help strengthen marriages and relationships for people living in the Chattanooga, Tennessee area. So that's another example of a group that's doing this kind of work.
And these kinds of efforts to promote the culture of marriage can only be done on a private basis, right? Like, you can't imagine the government ever investing in a public service campaign on marriage the way they might for anti-smoking campaigns, or right? Because I'm thinking that must be so, because what is the definition of marriage? If you ask the government, maybe their definition is impossible to promote.
Yeah, I think that it would be more difficult for the government to launch a successful marriage campaign, particularly one that's sort of trying to do things like promote classes, or obviously kind of a more sort of thicker account of marriage, and family life. I do think that we could have some simple messages out from the government that would do things like promote the success sequence. The government does sponsor lots of ads related to fathers that are, I think, generally well done. So I think there's some ways the government can be helpful here, but I think you're right that sort of the biggest work that can and should be done on this front would be done by nonprofits, churches and other groups that can give people a kind of a richer and deeper vision of married life than what Uncle Sam could do for us.
You know what I'm experiencing with my older children and their cohorts, the people in the young people like them, is that cohabitation is taking, in many ways, the place of marriage. For instance, my daughters were defining her wedding list, who she's going to invite, and it gets complicated. It used to be that you would invite people and their spouses, and now you wonder, do I need to invite everyone people are living with? Are these people really in their lives in a way that a married person is, what they call now a partner? How do you find? I'm sure you must know a lot about cohabitation and how it's taking the place of marriage. Is that a very worrying trend?
Well, I think cohabitation is a worrisome trend in the sense that particularly a lot of people are having kids in cohabiting unions, and the problem with that is that those unions are much less stable than married families. So I think one of the challenges facing us is really to get people to recognize, to realize, and sort of change their behavior in terms of understanding that kids are much more likely to flourish when they have two committed parents who are committed to one another and to going the distance, for them as well. And that kind of anchoring commitment is much more likely to be found in a married family than in a cohabiting family. So, what we do to make marriage more, I think, compelling is just to sort of stress both the importance of marriage, the important way that marriage gives kids stability, but also to get people to realize there's a kind of a successful sequence too for dating. And this has been, I think, really developed by a guy named Dr. Scott Stanley and a woman named Dr. Galena Rhodes at the University of Denver. And their work suggests that kind of if you sequence sort of your dating life in ways that you're kind of moving deliberately, talking through decisions, and not sliding through your relationship, you're much more likely to forge a good marriage. And part of that is not cohabiting with someone on a kind of a casual basis, because that amounts to kind of sliding through a major, sequence in your relationship. And they would encourage you to be more decisive about trying to figure out if there's a basis for friendship beyond just physical and romantic attraction. Getting into the character of your boyfriend or girlfriend, and then moving towards engagement and marriage.
I remember seeing this study when it came out. It almost sort of suggested there's two kinds of cohabitation. There's people who are cohabitating, either they're already engaged and planning to get married and they're just trying to save rent money, or people who are like, I don't know where this is going. Let's move in together. And another thing I've seen in your writing and research that's interesting, and I think a lot of people don't realize, and I'm seeing this now play out in the life of someone very close to me, is that if you cohabitated and had a child before getting married, even if you eventually do get married, you have a significantly higher odds of getting divorced. And so there does, seem to be some sort of connection between that, to the point of being purposeful and following the sequence. Shifting topics, one of the studies that caught our attention was one that I think came out pretty recently. I think you mentioned it in our last segment, and seems to have gotten a lot of publicity. Found that women, the most likely women to be happy in their marriage are religious conservatives. And I was interested to see in the study that actually right behind them are religious progressives. And then that the most likely or the least likely to be happy were, I believe it was secular conservatives. Could you tell us a little bit about the findings of that study and what all of it means?
So the research indicates that women who share a faith with their husbands are markedly happier and they're less likely to get divorced. And we do find that religious conservative women are the happiest wives in America. And in terms of making sense of those findings, I think there are sort of two things going on here. One is that just sort of having that common faith puts you in touch with a network of people, often who are family-oriented. They're kind of there for you in your corner as you're dealing with the challenges of marriage and family life. The second thing I would say is that people who have a faith are more likely to handle life's difficulties, things like the loss of a loved one or unemployment, successfully, because they have this view that God is in their lives and working with them and sort of accompanying them in the midst of their struggles and tribulations. And there's also a way in which faith is linked to stronger norms about things like fidelity and forgiveness, which are helpful for marriage as well. And I think conservative religious women are especially likely to be flourishing because they're more likely to have a strong sense of commitment to marriage and to appreciate that women and men are different. And I think that appreciation for male and female difference allows them to navigate relationships and family life more successfully, just because they don't expect that their husbands are going to be just like their girlfriends or sisters, and makes them more adept at navigating the challenges of a marital relationship because they appreciate that men are a bit different. And so when the husband kind of like shuts down in the face of a conflict or retreats to his study or his garage, I think that's less threatening for a more conservative-minded woman than it is for a more progressive woman, because she's probably more likely to understand and appreciate that, guys actually handle conflict differently than women on average. And, so these kinds of sex differences are not as, threatening to their sense of the marriage and where it's headed. But
so accepting... Go ahead, Dr. Wilcox.
Yeah, so it's, accepting those differences is kind of like par for the course. But I think what's interesting too is that secular conservative women are the least happy, and I think what's perhaps happening there is that guys who have a traditional mindset but don't kind of link it to an ethic of service or don't link it to a real commitment to their family are, I suspect, just not very good husbands these days. They're just probably not as emotionally and practically engaged in the marriage and in the life of the family, whereas I think that religiously conservative men, have both a personal sense that their marriage and family is important, and they're getting encouraged by their friends and their pastor or their priest, to be intentional about being good husbands and good fathers in ways that, redound to the benefit of their spouse and children.
And maybe also the secular conservative women don't have the philosophy of religious women. in order to make sense of these sex differences and the complementarity. They don't have that help, no, of our philosophies.
Yeah, that's certainly, I think, a possibility. But my intuition here is that kind of a secular conservatism often can give men a kind of permission slip for doing the minimum, and that,
as though they needed that.
Not good. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
Well, you do. I read this article. You wrote an article, Religious Men Can Be Devoted Dads Too, which I think is to this point. Because, the point of the article was that the idea is that liberal marriages, people think that liberal marriages that are egalitarian, right, where the men and women believe that they should split everything the same, that men should come home and clean after work, that those would have above average satisfaction, that the women would be very happy in those marriages. But the fact is that religious dads, religious men, also find, and what you just mentioned, that sense of service to their spouse and to their children, a very good reason to be that helping hand, those helping hands for an overworked mom.
Right. It's important to know, I think, that we see, religiously conservative dads tend to be more engaged with their kids, as well as more egalitarian-minded dads, where the difference is that egalitarian men are more likely to share housework, and religious dads are more likely to focus on breadwinning. So there's a kind of a different way in which they think they're supporting their families by either focusing more on housework on the part of the progressive dads, or focusing more on giving their families, more financial support on the part of the religious dads. But what they share in common is being more practical and emotionally engaged with their wives and with the kids on evenings and weekends.
Well, that does sound like a recipe for happiness, I can say, as the mom of 5. An engaged dad is a wonderful thing.
Important.
I noticed from just reading your work, reading all your different projects, that you must be working with all sorts of different kinds of people. You must have a lot of secular researchers that work with you. What's it like working with people who are completely secular and looking at the same data? Do you find yourselves coming to different conclusions?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I have experienced is working with colleagues, including Nick Wolfinger at the University of Utah, who are, more progressive, secular, whatever else it might be, compared to where I sort of sit, look at the world. And a point, though, of common ground for us is kind of our commitment to kind of just basically running the regressions and sort of seeing where the numbers fall. And there are some things that you can't really adjudicate by, running a statistical regression. There are sort of subtle arguments you can make about culture, for instance, that you can't really, kind of build a data set and then just run the numbers and get the answer you might be looking for. I think, for instance, of what happened in the 1960s in terms of dramatic increases in single motherhood. Conservatives would sort of stress welfare policy or cultural shifts. Liberals would talk about economic changes. And there's, not all these things can easily be adjudicated by a data set or a couple of data sets. But there are some kind of concrete, topics that Nick and I have tackled, looking at the link between religion and relationship happiness for blacks, Latinos, and whites. And, Nick runs the numbers, and it's pretty clear that people who are religious are about 10 percentage points more likely to be happy in their relationships. And so, given the finding, Nick just, reports that with me. And so that's sort of the basis for our collaboration as a kind of a joint commitment to sort of following the data wherever it shall lead. So there are people out there like that, and I can work easily with them.
Well, Dr. Wilcox, I'm really glad that you're following the data, and I think that you are providing some really important information and what has to be the most important topic of our day, right? The marriage and family. So thank you so much for joining us. Where can our listeners find more about your work?
FamilyStudies.org, and I'm on Twitter at WilcoxNMP.
Oh, well, I'll be following you right now. And thank you, Dr. Wilcox. Next up, we have Father Roger Landry joining us for his weekly homily that he's so kind as to give us. Every morning, the Catholic Association reviews all the latest news and sends our subscribers a carefully curated collection of the most important news of the day. Items are specifically selected for a smart Catholic audience like you. Don't let the world take you by surprise. Subscribe to our daily media roundup at thecatholicassociation.org. This week, as is customary, Father Roger Landry gives us a short but brilliant homily on this coming Sunday's Gospel. Please stay tuned for Father Landry, and do look up his daily homily written in audio on his website, catholicpreaching.com.
This is Father Roger Landry, and it's a joy to have a chance to ponder with you the consequential conversation Jesus wants to have with all of us this Sunday. Last week, you remember, Jesus presented us the parable of the prayer of the Pharisee and the publican, both of whom had gone up to the temple to pray, and both left, but only one's prayer was heard. The one who left justified was not the outwardly devout Pharisee who fasted twice a week, gave 10% of his income back to God, and rejoiced that he was not a thief, rogue, adulterer, or tax collector. The one who left with a right relationship toward God was a humble publican, stood at the back, beat his breast, and begged, "God be merciful to me, a sinner." In the gospel we will encounter this Sunday, we encounter those characters from the parable, self-righteous good people who complain that Jesus actually interacts with sinners, and a notorious humble tax collector in real life. And we see how the God-man responds when such a sinner calls out to him for mercy. Jesus called himself the Good Shepherd and said that he would leave the 99 to go in search of the one sheep who was lost. Before that Good Shepherd headed up to Jerusalem to lay down his life for sheep, first wanted to hunt down one who was lost. He went to literally the nethermost place on earth in search of perhaps the greatest public sinner of that city to bring him back to his fold. He went to Jericho, the lowest city on the planet, 853 feet below sea level, to find Zacchaeus, who's not just one of a bunch of despised and excommunicated tax collectors loathsome to the Jewish authorities, but the chief tax collector of the whole region. Jesus left the crowds behind and entered alone with the tax collector into his home and into his life. He called Zacchaeus his lost sheep by name. The very name Zacchaeus means God remembers, and God had never forgotten him. Heaven rejoiced on that day more for his return than for those who had never wandered. So Jesus takes the initiative of knocking at the door of our soul, asking for entry, coming to us wherever we are, no matter the depths to which we've sunk, no matter the fact that perhaps everyone else around us might despise us. To the extent that we, like Zacchaeus, repent of whatever sins we've committed and accept Jesus' gracious invitation by welcoming him with delight, we too, like Zacchaeus, can have salvation come to us. This is the first of the three lessons we learn from the story of Zacchaeus and Jesus, that Jesus wants to take us apart from the crowd and bring us the salvation of his mercy. The place where Jesus ordinarily does this is where St. John Paul II used to say, Jesus and the whole church exist solely for each one of us alone, the confessional. The sacrament of confession, Jesus ministers to us individually, just as he interacted individually with Zacchaeus. But like Zacchaeus, we need to come down, to leave the perches of our pride, and allow Jesus to work through his priestly ministers. Second thing we learn from this encounter with Zacchaeus is about the diminutive tax collector's hunger to see Jesus. Zacchaeus' climbing of the sycamore tree is more than an interesting detail. The text tells us he was trying to see Jesus, but couldn't because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a tree along Jesus' route in order to have a chance to glance at him. We too are often blocked from seeing the Lord because other people get in the way. They block our sight in many ways. Parents block the sight of their children when they don't pray with them or take them to Mass. Cultural forces like those in the entertainment industry or in public schools or institutions of higher learning impede our vision by distorting Jesus' image, ignoring him altogether, or ridiculing those who believe in him. Sometimes even those who should be icons of Jesus, priests, religious, catechists, godparents, obscure our vision because rather than reflecting the image of Jesus to us through virtue, they obstruct it through unchristian behavior. Zacchaeus' example challenges each of us to consider what is the extent to which we go, what trees or obstacles we'll mount in order to see Jesus more clearly. The third thing this episode with Zacchaeus teaches us is that a true conversion to God also brings about a real conversion to others. Even though he, like his fellow tax collectors, would have been guilty of ripping off the people of Jericho by basically shaking them down for unjust commissions beyond what the tax collectors needed to send to Rome. Zacchaeus knew that he needed to make amends. From that point forward, he used the gift of his office to do good rather than evil. So he told Jesus, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I'll give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay it back 4 times as much." Strict justice would have required his giving back precisely what he had overcharged. If he had really wanted to be kind, he would have given it back with interest. But he was going to give it back with 400% interest, which was a sign of great contrition for the gravity of his previous sin of stealing and intimidation. Similarly, we're called to examine our consciences and to make amends with those we've injured through our sins. We need to apologize, to repair the harm we've caused through gossip, for example, to make restitution for the things we've stolen from family members or work or from strangers or from the poor through our selfishness. And we need to do so extravagantly. At Mass this Sunday, we'll see just how extravagant Jesus can be. When he knew that we and the whole human race were incapable of seeing him on account of the great weight of sin that was reducing our humanity to smaller images of what we're called to be. And thereby, when we were incapable of climbing any tree at all, he, out of his great love for us, climbed a tree on our own behalf, so that each of us might be able to see him perched upon his glorious wooden throne. He who comes to seek and save what was lost will call each of us by name and say to us from the cross, "I must stay in your house today." He will invite us to be lifted up by him onto the life-giving cruciform tree, so that as God's children we might spend eternity in that celestial treehouse built upon the cross's firm foundation. And then in Eucharistic form, he will come to stay with us all day. Let's get ready. God bless you.
Thank you so much, Father Landry. It's so kind of you to join us every week to give us that beautiful homily to prepare us for this Sunday's Gospel. Now it's time to say goodbye. Unfortunately, we've had a great show. Thank you so much, Ashley, for joining me all the way from D.C. Thank you for making time.
Yeah, it was a treat. It's always a delight to talk to somebody like Brad, who is just a wealth of information on such an important issue.
You know, I really feel that that all this data that he's collecting and the way that he's putting it out there in important public, in mainstream publications, is going to have a real impact on the way that if we are ever going to recapture marriage, if we're ever going to reignite marriage in our culture. So it was really good of him to join us. This is your hostess, Dr. Grazie Christie of the Catholic Association, joined today by my colleague Ashley McGuire and our great guest, Dr. Brad Wilcox. If you've been listening on the radio, thank you for listening to Conversations with Consequences on the Guadalupe Radio Network on 11 a.m. on Fridays. Be sure to subscribe to our podcasts. You can go to thecatholicassociation.org to subscribe for free. Thank you, and we'll talk to you next week.